Okay, part two of our English colonization. We want to talk about the 7 Years' War. At least that's what it's called in Europe. So, Maria Theresa wants Silesia back, and she begins to rebuild her army, working diplomatically through her foreign minister. She is able to separate France from Prussia. And in 1756, France abandoned Prussia and allies with Austria. Russia also joins the new alliance. So now Prussia has to reach out to the one side, the one country that will always fight the French, Great Britain. They ally with Prussia, though Great Britain really fights mostly elsewhere. There are three major areas of conflict: Europe, India, and North America. In Europe, Frederick the Great of Prussia is able to beat Austria, France, and Russia for a time, even winning the Battle of Rossbach in Saxony in 1757. Now, it's kind of like if you ever watched wrestling as a kid or still do, you know how one guy is fighting and all of a sudden everybody just beats up on him and comes in and jumps him. He does well for a while, but then the numbers catch up. That's what's happening to Frederick. What saves him, as his forces are worn down, is the death of Tsarina Elizabeth of Russia. The throne then goes to Peter III, who is basically a fanboy of Frederick the Great. So much so, I mean, if it was a teenager, he'd have a poster of Frederick the Great in his bedroom. So he didn't want to fight his idol, so he withdrew the Russian forces. That led to a stalemate. With the Peace of Hubertsburg, in 1763, all occupied territory was returned. Austria had to recognize Prussian control of Silesia, so it didn't work out too well. In India, it's called the Great War for Empire. This is the French versus the British, but they don't fight each other outright. They each support, it's a proxy war, they each support an opposing Indian prince. The British ultimately went out with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and Treaty of Paris that's a pretty common one. The French withdrew, left India to the British, which, is a complicated history. So in North America, we have the French and Indian War. Lasts from 1754 to 1763. It is for control of the Ohio country. The French built forts in upstate New York and western Pennsylvania. The British sent a major named George Washington to tell the French to leave the area. The French refused. In 1754, Washington went back with 150 volunteers with Indian allies. They were to build a fort, but they were too late. But they were able to ambush and kill members of the French scouting party. They will set up Fort Necessity on July 3rd, 1754, which they are forced to surrender in the Battle of Great Meadows, where they lost 100 out of 300 soldiers. Now, what this will lead to is a concern in the colonies about this war, Native Americans, all kinds of things. It'll lead to what will be called the Albany Plan. This called for a group of delegates from the colonies, and 21 showed up from 7 colonies. Thanks to Ben Franklin, they approved what was called the Albany Plan of Union. The 11 colonies would band together under a new president who was appointed by the king, who would also hold a Grand Council of Colonies, and he would have jurisdiction over, quote, Indian affairs. The idea was that, one person to take care of foreign policy, essentially. This was too radical, so it doesn't hold up. The British will attack the French in June of 1755. They will expel 11,500 French Catholics out of Canada and made them relocate down to the bayou in Louisiana. They become the Cajuns, very interesting people. So think about that. You're used to the climate of Canada, and then all of a sudden you are forced to go to Louisiana. Place no one really wants to go to. Kidding. So we have a back and forth. We have Edward Braddock will lose a battle in 1755. He'll die from his wounds. Ultimately, what will bring the war to the end is the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The French gave away Canada and the lands to the east to the British. Spain got involved. They gave Florida to the British, and they received the Louisiana Territory in return. So technically, when we bought it from Napoleon, it wasn't his. By 1763, Great Britain will become a great colonial power, and we will see standing armies begin to rise. Now, what's the importance of all this? Well, it leads to the training of some military men like George Washington. So, one group that was very unhappy were Native Americans. They were not happy, they were left out. They weren't happy that the French essentially gave up their land. And so in 1763, we have what is called Pontiac's Rebellion, which was a Native American uprising against the colonists. We name a car after that. So what comes out of it from the king and parliament is called the Proclamation of 1763, which basically said that the British territory only goes to the Appalachian Mountains, and that the land west of that would forever be Indian country. We see how well that holds up. Now, part of that was to appease the Native Americans. The other part was to help control the colonists. What they found was it was harder to control the colonists as they began to spread out across the continent. So they're trying to keep them in one place. There's actually an episode of Sliders, a science fiction show that kind of looked at a British America in the present day and its difficulties. So now you have a situation where basically the British feel like the colonists are not paying their fair share of taxes. And the truth is, I think I mentioned in the last video, they were paying less in taxes than the rest of the British world. But they were stuck on that representation thing. So the Prime Minister, George Grenville, wanted the colonists to pay for more. And one way that they tried earlier was the Molasses Act of 1737, because smugglers were avoiding taxation by getting molasses from the French Caribbean. So they wanted to force the colonists to buy British molasses. In 1764, we have the American Revenue Act, also known as the Sugar Act. It actually cut taxes on the molasses in half, but it added taxes on other goods. Nominally, the idea was the money was for defense. They also passed the Currency Act, which said that the colonists could not print paper money. They had to be gold, silver, or based on a commodity like tobacco. Actually, we're going to have tobacco-based currency in places like North Carolina for some time. We also get the Quartering Act of 1765, which required the feeding and quartering of soldiers. We have the Stamp Act of 1765, which said you had to purchase stamps for papers, including newspapers. So you actually had to buy a stamp for each individual newspaper. Obviously, the colonists became very upset, especially of their lack of representation. We began to see protests. Patrick Henry and the Sons of Liberty. You see a non-importation movement. This is the beginnings of the Daughters of Liberty. In 1765, Massachusetts called for a Stamp Act Congress and put out a Declaration of Rights and Grievances of the colonies. Grenville will be replaced by Lord Rockingham because he annoyed the colonists too much. They did repeal the Stamp Act, but they also passed at the same time the Declaratory Act that basically said, we rule you, we can do whatever we want, we will make you pay what you want, we own you. Basically, it's the Cartman Act. It's whatever, we do what we want, but then they cut the tax anyway. They got rid of the Sugar Act. Then William Pitt becomes prime minister. He has a treasury chief named Charles Townshend, who pushed the Townshend Act in 1767, which taxed, and you can see how all these are related, glass, lead, paint, paper, and tin. And so what you begin to see in this country is a split between patriots and loyalists. Now, you have some people running around calling themselves 3%ers who said only 3% of the country were actually patriots. That is stupid and wrong. What you really had is about a third would be classified as patriots, a third would be loyalists, and a third just wanted to be left the hell alone. In 1770, we will have the Boston Massacre. March 5th, 1770, Crispus Attucks, an African American, will be killed. Samuel Adams will actually have a lot to do with agitating that. It will lead to the Boston Tea Party, the first example of cosplay in North America, as colonists dressed up as Native Americans and threw the tea into the harbor. This led to the Coercive or Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor and gave them a new military governor. This will lead to the First Continental Congress in September 5th, 1774. We will have fighting at Lexington and Concord. Paul Revere will basically get the credit for the British coming, but he doesn't actually complete it. William Dowles does, but Paul Revere gets all the credit. This leads to outright rebellion. On June 5th, 1775, the Continental Congress will name George Washington head of the Colonial Army. He acted all surprised, but basically he really lobbied for this. He was a delegate. He would basically show up every day in his military uniform, talk about the importance of military, and be like, mm-hmm. And then, he acts all surprised when he's named commander. He's like, what? Oh my God, really? Okay, I'll take it. Well, maybe not really. Then the first fighting will be at Bunker Hill, really Breed Hill. There will be 1,054 British casualties. The colonies are declared an open rebellion, even though the Continental Congress does put out the olive branch petition to King George III, asking him to, saying we're being mistreated by Parliament. It would be really awesome if you would step in. George III was mad. This was one of his lucid moments. There's a movie called Madness of King George. He suffered from bouts of insanity. In fact, sometimes he actually would talk to a tree in the courtyard because he thought it was the Prussian ambassador, who are very wooden people. In January of 1776, we'll have Thomas Paine, Common Sense, and this is where we begin to see the move toward independence, which is what we'll be talking about next week. And I hope to be able to find a copy of 1776 to share with you guys, so we can kind of talk about pop culture and fact versus fiction, kind of like what we do with them movie critiques. So anyway, finally, that's it. We'll have these lecture videos and then a couple of other videos and probably some supplemental videos that you can watch if you want to. Hope everything is going well, and I will talk to you all later. I'm looking forward to seeing your discussion.